It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. If you've ever picked up Jane Austen's masterpiece, you definitely know this famous opening line. It sounds so grand, doesn't it? Like a sweeping romantic truth. But actually, here's the brilliant twist. It totally conceals a biting ironic deflation. Right out of the gate, that very first sentence is a subtle inside joke about the completely mercenary, transactional business of marriage in early 19th century England. It really sets this tone of quiet sarcasm that runs through the whole shebang.
Which brings us to a kind of fascinating question. How do we actually view Jane Austen? For the longest time, pop culture has basically painted her as just a romance writer. You know, spinning these lovely tales of balls and pretty dresses and polite courtships. But as we're going to see, that misses the mark entirely. Actually, scratch that. It misses it by a mile. Austen was literally a razor-sharp social critic. She used that seemingly narrow, quiet domestic sphere, the drawing rooms and country estates, to dissect the rigid and honestly often absurd structures of her society.
So, in this explainer, we're going to completely reframe this beloved story. Instead of just looking at it as a charming romance between Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy, we're going to dive into it as a multi-layered masterclass in social commentary. Austen is taking direct aim here. She's targeting the rigid class structures, the aristocratic status quo, and that underlying very real financial desperation that essentially governed women's lives back then.
Okay, let's dive into this. We'll be exploring three main lenses today. 1. The funhouse mirror of law. 2. Class, rank, and status. And 3. Doing things with words.
Starting with Part 1, the funhouse mirror of law, land, legacy, and the Bennets. So, resuming away from the romance for a second, and looking directly at the dirt, the soil itself, because the entire plot of this novel is essentially driven by a very real, absolutely terrifying legal panic over losing land. It all comes down to a concept called an entailment, or fee tail. Basically, this was an old-school legal device used to satisfy a family's dynastic urge to keep all their property locked down within a single family line, and yeah, usually the male line. Now, because the Bennet family has 5 daughters and 0 sons, their estate, Longbourn, is entailed away from them. The second Mr. Bennet dies, the property legally passes to their cousin, the totally horrid, long-winded, and obsequious Mr. Collins. And this single legal reality is what damns the Bennet women to poverty. It literally forces Mrs. Bennet into this frantic, completely undignified hunt for husbands just so her girls can survive.
But here's where history gives us a massive plot twist. If we look at the actual historical reality of English property law at the time, Austen actually got the law wrong. During her era, a family like the Bennets wouldn't have relied on a pure entailment like that. They would have used something called a strict settlement, which generally made some sort of financial provision for daughters. Plus, even if it was just a simple entailment, historically speaking, Mr. Bennet legally could have engaged in a proceeding to bar the entail, using a legal loophole called a common recovery. Basically, he had a legal out to save his daughter's inheritance.
So, did Jane Austen just botch the law? Well, scholars argue that whether she knew the exact legal intricacies or not doesn't really matter. She deliberately created this funhouse mirror effect. She distorted the legal reality to perfectly reflect a much bigger societal truth. By making the entailment an absolute, unbreakable trap in her story, she forces her characters, and us as readers, to confront a society that prioritized economic pragmatism and hoarding dynastic wealth over justice, common sense, and, actually marrying for companionship.
Let's move to Part 2 and see how this builds. Class, rank, and status, the invisible boundaries.
Shifting from the physical land boundaries to the invisible boundaries of 19th century society, just look at how this world was actually carved up. The social ladder back then was incredibly complex and fiercely guarded. Right at the very top, you've got the aristocrats. Think of the dictatorial Lady Catherine, who derive all their power from inherited titles and massive tracts of land. Right below them is the gentry. These are characters like the Bennets or the ultra-wealthy Mr. Darcy. They're unified by the fact that they own land and absolutely do not have to work for a living. But creeping up right beneath them is this massive disruption, the newly emerging middle class. Characters like the Bingleys and the Gardners are making absolute fortunes, sometimes way richer than the gentry, like the Bingleys pulling in £100,000 through trade and business. The old lines were blurring fast, and the upper classes were panicking.
And this brilliantly illustrates a massive tension running through the whole novel, the stark difference between economic class and personal status.
Lady Catherine relies entirely on her aristocratic rank to demand respect, right? Yet she has absolutely zero manners or true personal status. Meanwhile, the Gardiners are middle-class tradespeople. That's a fact that makes the incredibly snobbish Bingley's sisters mock them as vulgar. Yet the Gardiners actually possess incredibly high status because they are genuinely elegant, sensible, and well-bred. Austen is showing us right here that true gentlemanliness is about how you behave, not just what's in your bank account or the title before your name.
Which brings us to part 3, doing things with words, Elizabeth's linguistic rebellion.
So how do you fight back against these massive, oppressive social constraints when you have no money and absolutely no power? You use language. Abstract language literally becomes Elizabeth Bennet's ultimate weapon. To understand this, we have to look at philosopher J.L. Austen and his theory of performative utterances. These are words that don't just state facts, they actively perform an action. Think of a judge banging a gavel and saying, "I sentence you," or someone saying, "I promise." In Austen's society, aristocratic characters like Lady Catherine fully expect their words to act as sovereign, unquestionable commands. When she issues a warning or an insult, she expects it to instantly alter reality and force people to comply. No questions asked.
And this sets the stage for the most thrilling showdown in the whole story. Lady Catherine travels all the way to the Bennets' home specifically to deploy one of these performative utterances. She demands that Elizabeth promise never to marry Mr. Darcy. She tries to force this binding declaration. But Elizabeth, she simply refuses to play by the rules of subservient convention. She flat out refuses to make the promise, and she refuses to give Lady Catherine the answers she's demanding. By doing this, she catches the aristocrat completely out of order. She completely neutralizes the prolocutory power of her words. Lady Catherine's grand commands just collapse into frustrated, powerless wishes.
So, the crucial point is captured perfectly right here. Facing down the absolute fury of the aristocracy, Elizabeth says, "He is a gentleman. I am a gentleman's daughter. So far, we are equal." This is Elizabeth's ultimate performative triumph. She leverages a linguistic meritocracy to totally level the playing field. She bypasses Lady Catherine's inherited power entirely and asserts her own autonomy as a modern individual. It's a real game changer.
Moving into part 4, the satire of society, Austen's targets.
By understanding these legal, social, and linguistic battles, we really start to see Jane Austen's broader satirical aim here. She's systematically exposing the highly transactional and, quite frankly, totally vulgar nature of early 19th century relationships. She gives us two very different types of survival to look at. On one hand, you have Charlotte Lucas. Now, Charlotte is practical, she's poor, and she's getting older. So she marries the incredibly pompous, foolish Mr. Collins purely for an establishment, which is basically just a roof over her head. Austen is definitely wryly sympathetic here, but she makes sure we see what a grim reality this is. On the other hand, of course, you have Elizabeth and Darcy. Their eventual union represents Austen's true ideal. It's a marriage based not on desperate economics or aristocratic hoarding, but on genuine love, mutual respect, and personal merit.
And finally, part 5, a shifting world, the grand takeaway. When we bring all three of these lenses together, the legal traps, the class anxiety, and that amazing linguistic rebellion, it reveals the ultimate grand meaning behind Austen's masterpiece. Elizabeth's defiance and Darcy's willingness to actually change his proud behavior, well, they aren't just romantic plot points. They mirror a massive real-world historical shift that was happening right outside Jane Austen's window. The strict inherited feudal order, the one represented by Lady Catherine, is crumbling. It's on the decline. And in its place, we're seeing the rise of modern bourgeois individualism. It's a world where personal merit, emotional intelligence, and your own personal happiness finally begin to triumph over strict societal compliance. Elizabeth wins because she simply refuses to let outdated rules dictate her reality.
And it leaves us with a truly memorable thought. Jane Austen used her setting as this brilliant funhouse mirror to expose the absurd legal, social, and linguistic structures that were governing her world. If that exact same mirror were held up to our modern society today, what invisible boundaries, ridiculous status symbols, and absurd rules would be revealed for us? Thank you so much for exploring this fascinating topic with me. Keep questioning those structures around you and keep learning.